June 1945. An unnamed point in the Pacific Ocean. The deck of the Japanese whaling ship Shonan Maru is not merely a workspace. It is an altar of cruelty, paved with planks soaked through with the fat and blood of marine giants. The air here is heavy, thick. It smells of salt, rust, cheap fuel, and death. The sweet, nauseating stench of cooling flesh that seeps into clothing, into skin, into the very souls of those who work here. And it is onto this floating island of hell, in the midst of a boundless, watery desert, that fate has cast 7 American airmen. Captain Jacob Miller, commander of a B-29 bomber crew, was on his feet, but he could hardly feel them. His body was dehydrated, tormented by 9 days adrift on a life raft, his skin, covered in sores from salt water and the merciless sun, burned like fire. But all his physical agony was nothing compared to the icy horror that gripped his insides. He and his men, survivors of their Superfortress's crash, had been saved by the enemy. Around them, like silent shadows, stood the Japanese whalers. Their faces were as impenetrable as old no-theater masks, scorched by wind and sun, with deep wrinkles around eyes that held neither hatred nor sympathy, only a dull, ancient weariness. They were silent, their gazes heavy, appraising like butchers sizing up livestock. The Americans huddled together, wet, trembling, in the tattered remains of their flight uniforms, unarmed and utterly helpless. They had been gods, dropping fire from the heavens, and now they were pathetic captives on a slick, bloody deck, at the mercy of men whose homes they might have turned to ash just a week ago. Before Miller stood the whaling ship's captain, Kenji Tanaka, an old man with gray, close-cropped hair and a face like a dried piece of driftwood. He uttered not a word, only looking at Miller with his dark, deep-set eyes. In that gaze, the American tried to read their sentence. What awaited them? A quick end from a bullet to the back of the head, or would they be taken ashore to a far more terrible fate at the hands of the Kenpeitai, the military police whose cruelty was legendary? Tanaka slowly raised a hand and pointed to a small cabin. The gesture was understood without words. Isolation, a prison. Miller nodded. He knew any resistance was futile. He had to keep his men alive. Keep them alive until the end, whatever that end might be. As his crew staggered in the indicated direction, Miller paused for a second, his eyes meeting the Japanese captain's. And in that fraction of a moment, in that bottomless silence in the middle of the ocean, Captain Miller grasped the monstrous irony of their situation. They had survived the fire, survived the water, only for their lives to now depend on the mercy of a man who had every reason to hate them. And in the old Japanese man's eyes, he saw no answer. Only an abyss of age-old sorrow and weariness from a war that had consumed them all. But to understand how these two captains, an American and a Japanese, enemies by definition, ended up at this point of no return, locked on the same ship in the middle of a hostile world, we must go back 10 days. To that humid June evening when the world of the Superfortress crew with serial number 4263508, which they called St. Elmo's Fire, was still whole, humming, and full of life. 10 days earlier. An air base on the island of Tinian. The air here was thick and humid like a wet towel, saturated with the smells of tropical flowers, superheated metal, and high-octane aviation fuel. The island, this giant, unsinkable aircraft carrier, lived at a feverish, round-the-clock rhythm. Day and night, runways carved into the coral rock shuddered with the roar of thousands of Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines. Hundreds of silver bombers resembling giant predatory fish prepared to carry their deadly cargo north to the Japanese islands. The crew of St. Elmo's Fire was one of many, but to themselves, they were the whole world. 11 young men, bound together more tightly than blood brothers by the steel armor of their plane, and a shared destiny. Their commander, 27-year-old Captain Jacob Miller, was their rock. Short, sturdily built with a weathered face and calm gray eyes, he radiated a confidence that had a better effect on his subordinates than any sedative. He rarely raised his voice, His orders were precise and laconic, and every crew member knew that Miller would never send them where he wouldn't go first himself. That evening, he sat on an ammunition crate near his plane, writing a letter to his wife, Anna. He wrote about the heat, about the strange birds, about how much he missed the smell of cut grass back home in Ohio. He didn't write about the fear that sat like a cold lump in his stomach before every mission. He didn't write about the flashes of fires he saw from a height of 30,000 feet, which resembled scattered rubies on black velvet. That was his war, not hers. Beside him, co-pilot Lieutenant Bob Lucky Henderson was polishing his flight boots to a mirror shine. It was his ritual. The shinier the boots, the farther trouble stays away, he used to say, and no one dared to joke about it. The navigator, Lieutenant Samuel Sam Jacobs, a genius with maps and stars, sat in the shadow of the wing, rechecking his calculations for the 100th time. His pencil flew across the map, leaving thin, precise lines, roads of life and death. The flight engineer, Sergeant Frank Kowalski, a Pole from Chicago, as huge and good-natured as a bear, was tinkering with one of the engines, muttering something under his breath in a mix of English and Polish. He knew this machine better than his own wife and could feel any malfunction in his bones. And in the tail of the plane, in his small, glazed world, sat the gunner, 19-year-old Corporal Billy Evans, whom everyone called the Kid. He was reading comics and chewing gum, trying to look unfazed, but his eyes betrayed him. Fear rippled within them. This was his 5th combat mission. The target for tonight was Yokohama, a major port city and industrial center. At the briefing, they were shown photographs. They were explained the task: carpet bombing with incendiary bombs, destroy industrial facilities, break the will to resist. The colonel conducting the briefing spoke harshly and to the point. He didn't use words like city, people, women, children. He said target, grid, tonnage. War is mathematics. There was no place for emotions here. After the briefing, as they walked to their plane, the sky to the west turned crimson. The sunset was incredibly beautiful. Burning nicely, someone quipped grimly. No one laughed. They boarded the plane. Each took his place in this complex humming mechanism of aluminum and steel. Miller conducted a final check over the intercom. The voices of his men sounded steady and calm. They were ready. The engines roared to life, first one by one, then merging into a deafening chorus. St. Elmo's Fire rolled heavily down the runway, gaining speed. Miller smoothly pulled the yoke back, and the massive machine lifted off the ground, soaring into the darkening sky. Below remained the island, the lights of the base, a warm, safe world. Ahead lay only the night, the cold emptiness of altitude, and a fiery hell over Japan. That evening, Captain Miller did not yet know he was writing his last letter to his wife. He did not know that the thud he would hear in a few hours would not be the impact of an enemy shell against the armor, but the death rattle of his own aircraft, falling into the bottomless maw of the Pacific Ocean. 5 hours in the steel womb of a bomber is a meditation on the brink of madness. The monotonous, all-pervading hum of the 4 engines drilled into the brain, erasing all thoughts, leaving only a dull vibration in the bones. Outside was absolute, impenetrable blackness, through which ghostly clouds illuminated by the moon occasionally drifted. Inside the pressurized cabin, it was semi-dark, lit only by the dim glow of the instrument panels. Each crew member was at his station, having become an appendage of a complex system. They didn't speak unless necessary, conserving oxygen and energy. Communication was maintained via intercom with short, businesslike phrases. Pressure normal. Temperature normal. Course steady. But beneath this outward calm, under this mask of professionalism, tension lived in each of them. They were getting closer. Japan was near. The searchlights were the first to spot them. Long white tentacles of light shot into the sky, probing the clouds, trying to find the steel bodies of the superfortresses. St. Elmo's Fire was flying at an altitude of 28,000 feet, but the beams still reached them, making the pilot squint. It was like a giant, silent game of cat and mouse. And then, hell began. The ground below erupted in flashes of anti-aircraft fire. Black blossoms of flak began to bloom around the aircraft. Each such flower meant that hundreds of shrapnel fragments had flown past, any one of which could sever a control cable, puncture a fuel tank, or kill a man. The plane began to shake. The roar of the explosions could be heard even over the din of the engines. "Hold on, boys," Miller said calmly into the microphone, his hands gripping the yoke in a death grip. "On the bombing run," reported Navigator Jacobs. The bombardier, Lieutenant Peterson, pressed his eye to his sight. Below, in the crosshairs of his optics, the city lay spread out, a dark mass cut by threads of streets. The target was somewhere down there. "Bomb bay doors open," he reported. Cold air rushed into the plane. "Bombs away!" One by one, the deadly cylinders tumbled down, carrying fire and destruction with them. The plane felt noticeably lighter. All bombs dropped. Doors closed. "We're heading out." Peterson's voice was steady, almost indifferent. Miller banked the plane, turning the machine away from the target. Beneath the wing, they saw the dawn breaking below. But it was not the dawn of a new day. It was hundreds of fires merging into one vast, roaring sea of flames. And at that moment, retribution caught up with them. The impact was so powerful it tossed the plane like a toy. A warning light flashed. Fire in the fourth engine, then the third. "Fire! Fire in the right wing!" Kowalski shouted. The flames bursting from under the skin were visible even from the cockpit. They greedily devoured the aluminum, painting the night orange. "We've lost control! We're pulling right!" Henderson yelled. Miller threw his entire body against the yoke, trying to level the machine. It was useless. The Superfortress began to fall into a spin. "Bail out! Everybody out!" Miller ordered. It was his last command aboard. Saint Elmo's fire. He heard the clicks of opening hatches, the shouts of men. He tried to hold the plane steady just a little longer to give them a chance, but the relentless force of gravity was dragging them down. The screech of tearing metal, the howl of wind through the breaches, the roar of dying engines, it all merged into a final, deathly symphony. The impact with the water was instantaneous and absolute. For those inside, the world simply ceased to exist, replaced by darkness, pain, and the cold, salt water that flooded the mangled fuselage. Captain Miller was jolted awake by shock and the icy cold. He was still strapped to his seat, but the cockpit was already half filled with water. He frantically yanked the buckle of his harness, scrambled out of the seat, and swam towards the shattered cockpit canopy. Once outside, he saw the tail of his plane, his steel home, his fortress sinking beneath the waves. Debris floated all around, and in this chaotic mess, he heard shouts, the shouts of his men. He swam towards the sound, and at that moment, he knew. If they were to survive, he had to be more than just their commander. He had to become their anchor in this boundless ocean of despair. The first few hours after the crash were like a feverish, nightmarish dream. The cold water of the Pacific Ocean was a quick soberer, washing away the shock from their minds and leaving only a primal, animal fear. Miller, working with his last ounces of strength with the help of co-pilot Henderson, managed to find and inflate 2 life rafts. They were bright yellow, 2 tiny islands of hope in the endless blue. Gradually, one by one, they pulled the survivors from the water. Navigator Jacobs, flight engineer Kowalski, radio operator Riley, tail gunner Evans, and another gunner, Corporal Fisher. 7 in total, out of 11. They never found the other 4. The ocean had taken them without a trace. When dawn broke, the full picture of their disaster was revealed. They were alone. In every direction, as far as the horizon, stretched the vast, indifferent surface of the water. There was no land, no ships, no planes, only the sky above and the abyss below. Their prison was immense and empty. Miller's first act was to take inventory. The emergency supplies on the rafts were ridiculously meager. A few gallons of water in rubber flasks, packets of concentrated biscuits that tasted like pressed sawdust, a flare gun with a dozen rounds, a first aid kit, and fishing tackle. That was all that stood between them and death. The biggest problem was Sergeant Riley. He had been severely wounded in the crash. His leg was broken in several places and he had lost a lot of blood. He lay at the bottom of the raft, pale, his breathing shallow. Miller did his best to treat his wounds, using sulfa powder from the first aid kit, but he was no doctor. He knew that without real medical help, Riley had no chance. The first days blurred into one endless ordeal. During the day, the merciless sun scorched their skin and sucked the remaining moisture from their bodies. At night, a piercing cold forced them to huddle together for some warmth. But the most terrible enemy was thirst. They established a brutal rationing system, one swallow of water in the morning and one in the evening. But it was catastrophically insufficient. Lips cracked, tongues swelled, and a constant lump formed in their throats. Hunger was less torturous. They ate half a biscuit a day, but thoughts of food never left them. They remembered juicy steaks, fried potatoes, cold beer. These memories were both a comfort and a form of torture. On the second day, the sharks came. Large gray shadows began to circle the rafts. They didn't attack, just followed them, waiting patiently. Their presence was nerve-wracking, a constant reminder that they were in a foreign, hostile world, and that death was swimming just inches beneath the thin rubber bottom of their refuge. Panic and despair began to take hold of the men. Corporal Evans, the youngest of them, started to cry, quietly, silently, just letting tears fall into the ocean. Kowalski, huge and strong, sat with his head in his hands, rocking back and forth, muttering something in Polish. Miller knew he had to do something. The anarchy born of fear would kill them faster than thirst or sharks. On the evening of the third day, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in bloody hues, Miller gathered everyone who could sit up. His voice, hoarse from thirst, was firm. "Listen to me," he said. "We are not going to die here. Understood? We are the crew of a B-29. We survived a crash. We will survive this. From this moment, we live by rules. The first and most important rule is no one, you hear me, no one drinks seawater, even if you feel like you're dying. Whoever does that will kill himself and endanger all of us. That is an order." He looked each man in the eye. In their gazes he saw fear, doubt, but also a flicker of respect. They were still a crew, and he was their commander. This was their last armor against the chaos. But that same night, their number dwindled. Sergeant Riley died. He passed away quietly in his sleep without ever regaining consciousness. In the morning they said a short prayer over him and committed his body to the ocean. It was hard, but necessary. They had to breathe, to fight, to live. And they knew that now the sharks wouldn't just be following them, they had tasted human flesh. It seemed all was lost. But just then, when hope had almost turned to ash, Navigator Sam Jacobs, who had been silently gazing at the stars, uttered words that were both salvation and madness. "Captain, I think I know where we are." Hope is a strange, irrational feeling. It can be born from nothing, from a barely perceptible change in the wind's direction, from the shape of a cloud, from a quiet word spoken in the dark. For the tormented crew, drifting in the middle of a boundless ocean, hope came in the quiet voice of their navigator, Sam Jacobs. He wasn't a warrior like Miller, nor did he possess Kowalski's bear-like strength. His weapon wasn't muscle, but intellect. Night after night, while the others tried to find oblivion in fitful sleep, Sam lay on his back, staring at the starry sky. To the others, it was just a scattering of cold, distant lights. To him, it was a map. The map to their salvation. Using his knowledge of astronomy and a makeshift sextant fashioned from 2 pieces of debris and a thread, he was able to roughly determine their latitude. He watched the North Star, the constellations that were his old, faithful friends. "We're drifting southeast," he told Miller, his voice weak but confident. "The Kuroshio Current is carrying us towards the Marshall Islands. If my calculations are correct, the nearest atoll is about 500 miles away." 500 miles. It sounded like a death sentence. But at the same time, it was the first concrete, tangible piece of information in all these days of horror. They had a goal, not just to survive, but to move. This news acted like a powerful stimulant on the men. A glint appeared in their eyes. They began to act. Using a spare paddle and a piece of canvas, they fashioned a makeshift mast and sail. It was a pathetic, absurd contraption, but it worked. The wind, which had previously been their enemy, bringing the nightly chill, became their ally. The rafts began to crawl, slowly but surely, in the right direction. The next victory was food. The fishing tackle from the survival kit seemed like a useless toy in this vast ocean. But they tried again and again. On the 5th day, luck smiled on them. Corporal Fisher, who'd been holding the line for hours, felt a tug. Everyone froze. He carefully, slowly began to reel in the line. The struggle lasted for about 20 minutes, and then finally it appeared on the surface. A fairly large dorado shimmering in the sun with all the colors of the rainbow. They hauled it onto the raft. It was not just a fish. It was a trophy, a symbol of their victory over the ocean. They had no fire to cook it. They divided it into 6 equal parts and ate it raw. The taste of fresh, firm flesh after days of starvation on dry biscuits was divine. It was a feast. This small, pathetic victory, won in the very heart of a hostile element, gave them more strength than any order. They realized they were not just victims. They were hunters. They could fight back. This unexpected weapon, the combination of the navigator's scientific knowledge and the primal instinct of the hunter, changed everything. They were no longer passive sufferers awaiting death. They became active fighters for their own lives. But the ocean was not about to give up so easily. It had noticed their small victory, and it was preparing its response. That evening, as they were finishing the last of their catch, sharing every piece like a holy sacrament, Kowalski, who was on watch, suddenly said quietly, "Captain, look." Everyone turned. A few dozen yards from the rafts, a triangular fin emerged from the water. It was much larger than those they had seen before. It belonged to a great white shark. The predator was in no hurry. It circled their small flotilla slowly, studying, assessing. Its dark eye, cold and soulless, seemed to look directly into each of their souls. They had conquered hunger, but the scent of blood had attracted the attention of the true master of these waters, one who was truly hungry. The first victory over the abyss instilled in them a fragile but palpable confidence. They were no longer mere splinters of wood, carried at the mercy of the waves. They had become a state, a microscopic floating empire of 2 rubber rafts tied together with a rope, with its own laws, its own territory, and its own citizens fighting for existence. The leader of this empire, its undisputed emperor, was Captain Miller. His word was law. He established a strict, almost military daily routine, understanding that routine was the best medicine for panic and madness. Reveille at first light, morning calisthenics. As much as was possible in the cramped space of the raft, they stretched their stiff muscles to keep the blood flowing. Then, the morning ration. 1 swallow of precious water and 1/4 of a biscuit. After that, the workday began. Sam Jacobs, their Minister of Science, conducted his astronomical observations, refining their course. Kowalski and Fisher, being the strongest, were in charge of industry, fishing. They sat for hours with the line, patiently waiting for a bite, their faces focused and serious. Henderson and young Evans were assigned responsibility for the condition of the fleet. They constantly checked the rafts for punctures, pumped them up with a hand pump, and monitored the condition of the sail and ropes. Miller himself was the supreme commander and judge. He assigned watch duties for the horizon, settled all disputes, and maintained morale. In the evening, after a meager dinner, came culture time. To keep from going mad with boredom and fear, they talked. Each in turn told stories about his life before the war, about home, family, girlfriends, funny childhood incidents. These stories were not just a way to kill time. They were a reminder that they had a past, and therefore could have a future. They were men, not just dying animals. Their small empire gave them not only the physical resources for survival, but also a psychological foundation. Structure, order, purpose, all these things counteracted the chaos of the ocean. They created their own world, their own civilization in the midst of primordial wilderness. They even learned to collect rainwater by spreading the canvas during rare, short showers. Every sip of fresh, clean water was a true celebration, the greatest of treasures. But their growing organization, their fragile stability, could not deceive the main threat. A threat that came not from without, but from within. Despair was like the salt that permeated everything. It corroded not only the skin, but also the soul. And the most vulnerable to this corrosion was the youngest, Corporal Billy Evans. He withdrew more and more into himself, stopped participating in general conversations. His eyes became empty, lifeless. He just sat, staring at the horizon, and remained silent. Miller saw it. He tried to talk to him, to encourage him, but the boy didn't respond. He was broken. Something inside him had snapped, and Miller understood that a broken man in their situation was more dangerous than any shark. He was like gangrene that could spread through the entire body and kill them all. Their life had fallen into a harsh but predictable rhythm. They had learned to survive. But not all were prepared to live by the laws of the new world. In the soul of one of them, in the dark depths of his fear, a rebellion began to brew. A rebellion not against the captain, but against life itself. On the 7th day of their drift, the fragile equilibrium of their small world was shattered. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning the ocean's surface into a blinding mirror. The air was still and hot. The sail hung limp. They were trapped in a dead calm. And it was in this oppressive, ringing silence that the inner demon tormenting Billy Evans broke free. "A ship!" he suddenly screamed, jumping to his feet and rocking the raft. "I see a ship." His voice was shrill, breaking. Everyone looked where he was pointing. The horizon was empty. Absolutely empty. "Billy, sit down. There's nothing there," Miller said calmly. "There is. You just can't see it." "It's there," Evans insisted. His eyes shone with a feverish glint. He was seeing something that wasn't there. A mirage, born of despair and dehydration. Before anyone could stop him, he grabbed the flare gun. "Billy, no!" Miller shouted. But it was too late. A pop echoed, and a red rocket shot into the sky, leaving a smoky trail behind it. It flared brightly against the blue sky and slowly faded. Uselessly. They had wasted one of their precious chances of rescue. Anger and frustration swept over the others. "What have you done, you idiot?" Kowalski yelled, his fists clenched. "He's just a kid, Frank. Calm down." Henderson tried to intervene, but Evans wouldn't stop. "We're all going to die here," he screamed, his face contorted by tears and rage. "You don't understand. We're already dead men. This routine of yours, these talks, it's all a lie. We would have been better off drowning right away." It was a mutiny of despair, the voice of the fear that lived in each of them, but which they were afraid to let out. Miller knew this was the decisive moment. If he didn't quell this rebellion now, their empire would collapse. He approached Evans. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He applied what could be called surgical cruelty. He grabbed the boy by the tattered collar of his uniform and forced him to look him in the eye. "Yes, maybe we will die," he hissed in an icy tone, loud enough for all to hear. Maybe, but we will die as men, as soldiers, not as whimpering puppies. Do you understand me, Corporal? You can give up. You can lie down on the bottom of this raft and wait for the sharks to come for you. That's your right. But you will not dare take hope away from the others, from those who have decided to fight to the end. Then he did something no one expected. He let go of Evans and held out the flask with his share of water. Here, drink. You need it more. Evans stared at him, unable to believe his eyes. He had expected a blow, but received mercy. He slowly took the flask, took a sip, and began to cry. This time, they were not tears of despair, but tears of shame and relief. The mutiny was suppressed, not by force, but by wisdom. Miller had defended his law. The internal enemy was defeated, and their small brotherhood, having passed through this trial, became even stronger. They were a single crew again. They were ready to face any threat. But while they were dealing with their internal conflict, they didn't notice that their real enemy, the ocean itself, was preparing its final, devastating blow. On the western horizon, the sky began to darken. It was taking on a sick, violet-black hue. The wind they had been waiting for arrived suddenly with the fury of a wild beast. Ripples appeared on the water, quickly turning into whitecaps, and then into high, foaming waves. A storm was coming. The storm fell upon them with a primal, blind fury. The sky and ocean merged into one roaring gray mess. The wind howled like 1,000 demons, tearing the foam from the crests of giant waves. Their small rubber rafts, which had seemed like reliable arcs, were now no more than autumn leaves in a churning torrent. They were tossed up onto the crest of a wave from where a terrifying view of the surrounding water mountains opened up, and then hurled down with dizzying speed into a dark, churning abyss. Cold torrents of water crashed down on them, trying to wash them away, to drown them, to dissolve them. They clung to the safety lines with a death grip, their knuckles white. Every moment could be their last. They didn't scream. There was no strength for it. Their entire being was focused on one task: to hold on. This wasn't a battle. It was an execution. Miller, clinging to a line next to Evans, saw in the boy's eyes not panic anymore, but a kind of cold, detached resolve. The storm had washed away the last remnants of his childish fear, leaving only the will to live. All of them, united by the common threat, acted as a single organism. Kowalski used his massive body to shield Sam, who was the weakest among them. Henderson and Fisher tried to bail out water with their helmets, though it was like trying to bail out the ocean. At one point, a giant wave crashed over their heads. When Miller resurfaced, coughing and spitting out salt water, he saw with horror that the rope connecting the rafts had snapped. One raft, carrying Henderson and Kowalski, had been swept several dozen yards away. The distance between them was rapidly increasing. They were separated. This was the end. But then Miller saw Kowalski, without a second's hesitation, dive into the boiling water. He was a strong swimmer, but even for him, this was suicide. He swam, fighting the waves, and in his hand, he held the end of the broken rope. Miller and the others began to paddle with their hands, trying to get closer to him. It seemed impossible, but Kowalski was as stubborn as an ox. He made it. With his last strength, he handed Miller the end of the rope. Together they tied it, restoring their fragile connection. Kowalski, exhausted, collapsed onto the bottom of the raft. He had performed a heroic feat. He had saved them all from certain death alone. The storm raged for several more hours, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it subsided. When it was over, they lay at the bottom of the rafts, exhausted, chilled to the bone, but alive. They had endured. They had won. The price of victory was terrible. They had lost almost all their meager supplies: the first aid kit, the remaining biscuits, one of the 2 water containers. Everything had been washed away by the waves. They were on the verge of complete physical and moral exhaustion. They lay in the ensuing silence, listening only to the lapping of water against the sides. It seemed they no longer had the strength even to breathe, and it was at that moment, in that deafening silence after the storm, that Fisher, who was lying at the bow of the raft, suddenly let out a hoarse cry. But it was not a cry of terror. It was a cry of amazement. "Smoke," he whispered. Everyone raised their heads. On the horizon, where the sky was turning blue again, a thin, barely visible plume of smoke was visible. A ship. It was not a mirage. It was real. Hope, which they had ceased even to dream of, burst into their world with dazzling brightness. They began to shout, to wave their arms, to expend their last reserves of energy. Miller grabbed the flare gun. They had one last rocket. He fired it. A red star soared into the sky. The ship had spotted them. It was changing course, heading straight for them. Salvation was near. They cried, they laughed, they hugged each other. It was the end of their suffering. The ship drew closer. It wasn't a military vessel. It was civilian. Small, rusty, a workboat. And when it came close enough to make out the details, the laughter and tears froze on their faces. A flag was flying from the mast, a red circle on a white background, the flag of the rising sun, and on the bow of the vessel, pointing to the sky like a finger of fate, the black barrel of a harpoon cannon loomed. It was a Japanese whaling ship. Their saviors were their enemies. The moment they realized who their saviors were stretched into an eternity, the euphoria of rescue instantly gave way to an icy, paralyzing horror. They froze, staring at the approaching ship like rabbits before a snake. The Japanese sailors on board looked back at them with the same silent astonishment. For them, simple whalers encountering American airmen in the middle of the ocean was no less shocking an event. A ladder was thrown down to them. Climbing aboard felt like voluntarily ascending the scaffold. But they had no choice. To remain on the rafts meant certain death from thirst. Once on deck, they entered another world. A world that smelled of blood, fat, and death. They were surrounded. The Japanese were short, stocky men with weathered, inscrutable faces. There were no weapons in their hands, but their gazes were sharper than knives. The Americans huddled together, awaiting their fate. And then the captain appeared on the bridge. Kenji Tanaka, an old man with a face that looked like a map of his own hard life. He silently surveyed the prisoners. His gaze lingered on the scraps of their flight uniforms, on the insignia. He understood everything. Before him stood those whom the propaganda called air pirates, demons from the sky. Those who were burning his country. Within Tanaka, at that moment, a private, unseen war was raging. He was Japanese, a patriot. His duty demanded he immediately bind these men and hand them over to the authorities upon arrival in port. He knew what awaited them: interrogation by the Kempeitai, torture, and most likely, execution. But he was also a sailor. And the sea has its own unwritten laws, older than any war. A sailor does not abandon another sailor in distress, even if he is an enemy. The ocean is the common enemy of all who venture upon it. Furthermore, a deep, unhealed wound lived in his heart. Just 3 months ago, during one of the most terrible raids on Tokyo, his house had burned to the ground. His entire family had perished in the fire, his wife, his daughter, and his young grandson. He had received the news while at sea, and now, standing before him were the men who might have piloted one of those planes. Hatred, cold and sharp as a harpoon, rose from the depths of his soul, to hand them over for retribution, to commit an act of vengeance. It would be just, patriotic. But when he looked into Captain Miller's eyes, he did not see a demon. He saw a man, tired, tormented, but not broken. He saw another captain who, like himself, was responsible for his men, and something inside him wavered. He gave an order in Japanese. His first mate looked at him in disbelief, but obeyed. The prisoners were taken to a small cabin and locked in, but they were brought water and food, boiled rice, and a piece of salted fish. To the Americans, it was the most delicious meal of their lives. They didn't understand what was happening. They weren't killed. They were fed. This uncertainty was the worst part. They spent 3 days in this floating prison. They could hear the crew working, the ship creaking, but they couldn't understand a single word. The tension grew, and on the 4th day, the thing they feared most happened. A warship appeared on the horizon, a Japanese patrol boat. It was on an intercept course with the whaler. It was over now. The deception would be revealed. Captain Tanaka would have to make his choice. The patrol boat came alongside. A young, arrogant naval officer with 2 soldiers boarded the Shonan Maru. He saluted Tanaka and began to speak, his voice sharp and demanding. Miller and his men listened, holding their breath through the thin bulkhead. They didn't understand the words, but the intonation spoke for itself. It was an interrogation. The officer had apparently received a report of possible enemy contact. He asked if they had seen anything suspicious. And Miller heard the old captain's voice. It sounded even, calm, perhaps a little tired. Tanaka answered briefly, and in that moment, the entire fate of the 7 Americans depended on the words spoken by this old Japanese fisherman who had lost everything in the war. He could tell the truth and become a hero, or he could lie and become a traitor. Captain Kenji Tanaka faced the young lieutenant with an impassive expression. A storm raged within him, but on the outside, he was as calm as the ocean in a dead calm. He knew that this young officer, full of patriotic fervor and a thirst for glory, would not hesitate to take the Americans. For him, it would mean fame, a promotion, a medal. For the prisoners, it would mean the end. Tanaka began to speak slowly, weighing each word. He said they had been in this sector for several weeks. The fishing was poor. They had seen nothing unusual. No enemy planes, no submarines. Only the endless ocean and the occasional whale. The lieutenant listened, his gaze suspicious. He walked around the deck, peered into the hold. The soldiers stood at the ready. "And what's behind that locked door?" he asked, pointing to the cabin where the Americans were held. Miller's heart sank. This was it. "The sick are in there," Tanaka replied in a steady voice. "Dysentery. Contagious. It's better not to enter." It was a brazen, risky lie. If the officer ordered the door to be opened, everything would be revealed. Tanaka would be immediately arrested for treason, and his crew would likely face a court-martial. But there was so much aged confidence and authority in his voice, the authority of a captain who had spent his entire life at sea, that the lieutenant hesitated. He wrinkled his nose in disgust at the word dysentery. He had no desire to deal with sick fishermen. He glanced around the deck one more time at the old captain, at his crew standing silently behind him. They all played their parts perfectly. Not a single muscle twitched on their faces. Convinced that there was no glory to be found here, the lieutenant saluted, turned, and returned to his boat. A few minutes later, the patrol ship departed, leaving a foamy wake behind it. The danger had passed. Tanaka stood on the bridge and watched it go until it disappeared over the horizon. He felt neither relief nor joy, only a dull, heavy emptiness. He had just committed treason. He had saved his enemies. He had betrayed the memory of his fallen family. Or on the contrary, had he acted as a true human being, following a higher law, the law of conscience and maritime brotherhood? He did not know the answer. He had simply done what he had to do. In the following days, the atmosphere on the ship changed. The tension subsided, replaced by a silent, cautious understanding. The Americans were no longer kept under lock and key. They were allowed on deck. The language barrier remained insurmountable, but they began to communicate with gestures. The whalers shared their simple food with them, and the Americans, in turn, tried to help with the work where they could. They saw what hellish labor it was, butchering a whale carcass. They understood that these men were not fanatical warriors, but simple laborers, thrown into this bloody trade by the war. Miller often stood on the bridge next to Captain Tanaka. They would remain silent, looking out at the ocean. Two captains, two enemies, two men whom the war had first tried to destroy and then paradoxically bound together. They sailed for about 2 more weeks. And then one morning, they heard the news on the radio. The Emperor had announced Japan's surrender. The war was over. A few days later, the Shonan Maru entered the port of Yokosuka. The port was already occupied by American forces. Captain Tanaka handed the airmen he had rescued over to representatives of the American command. The officer who received them listened with surprise to Miller's brief account. He shook Tanaka's hand and offered him a reward. The old captain refused. He simply turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd on the pier. For the crew of St. Elmo's fire, it was a miracle, a return from the dead. Their incredible and paradoxical story was documented. They were sent home, to America. For Captain Tanaka, it was an act that his countrymen might have considered treason, an act he never spoke of to anyone ever again. Their brotherhood, forged in the heart of a hostile ocean, was destroyed by peace. Their heroic deed was buried in archival dust. For Captain Miller and his surviving crew, the return home was not a triumphal parade. They returned to a country celebrating victory, to a world desperately trying to forget the horrors of war. They were welcomed as heroes, but their story was too strange, too inconvenient for the simple, clear-cut headlines of the newspapers. Saved by the enemy? A Japanese captain who showed mercy? It didn't fit into the black and white picture of the world painted by propaganda. They were thoroughly debriefed by intelligence. They told their story again and again, but they saw disbelief in the officers' eyes. It sounded like a fabrication, a tall tale from a soldier. In the end, their report was classified and placed on a distant archive shelf under the heading, "Incredible, but possible." Their crew was disbanded, scattered to different parts of the country. Jacob Miller returned to his quiet town in Ohio to his wife, Anna. He tried to live a normal life, working as an insurance agent, raising children. But the war never let him go. At night, he didn't dream of the fire over Yokohama or the plane crash, but of the endless ocean and the silent, wrinkled face of the old Japanese captain. He was never able to fully understand the man's motives. Was it a manifestation of the code of Bushido, compassion for a defeated enemy? Or was it simply the act of a tired man who had lost everything and no longer saw the point in hatred? He would never know the answer. The fates of the other crew members varied. Sam Jacobs became a professor of astronomy at a university, telling his students about the stars that had once saved his life. Frank Kowalski returned to Chicago and opened his own auto repair shop. His huge hands, which had once tied a broken rope in a storm, now fixed engines. Billy Evans, the Kid, spent a long time being treated for post-traumatic stress. The war had left the deepest scars on his soul. He never fully recovered. Almost nothing is known about the fate of Captain Kenji Tanaka. He returned to a devastated, occupied country. His act, had it become known, would have brought shame and accusations of betrayal upon him. Most likely he remained a simple fisherman, the captain of a whaling ship for the rest of his days. He took his secret to his grave. Jacob Miller died in 1989 of a heart attack. He was buried in the old cemetery in his hometown. There were few people at his funeral. Family, a few friends. None of them knew the whole truth of what he had endured. No one knew about the 9 days in hell and the strange rescue. His story, like that of Captain Tanaka, was almost forgotten. But, as the locals told it, after his death, strange things would sometimes appear on his grave. Small, wooden figurines of whales, or just smooth stones polished by the sea surf. No one knew who brought them. The official history of the Second World War is written in the language of numbers, maps, and generals' memoirs. It has room for great battles, strategic decisions, and geopolitical consequences. But in this vast, meticulously chronicled history, there is almost no room for the small, quiet stories that played out far from headquarters and battlefields. The story of the crew of St. Elmo's Fire And the captain of the Shonan Maru did not make it into the textbooks. It did not become the plot of a Hollywood film. It dissolved in time, like thousands of other similar stories. Officially, their ordeal was forgotten. But it did not disappear without a trace. It became a legend. A soldier's tale, retold in whispers in the bars by veterans of the Air Force. It was said that somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, there is a phantom Japanese ship that picks up downed American airmen. Among Japanese sailors, there was a belief about an old captain who once met Oni, demons from the sky, and instead of killing them, he saved them, and that since then, his spirit protects those in distress at sea. This story turned into a myth because it was too real, too human for a cruel and inhuman time. It spoke not of enemies, but of people. Not of hatred, but of a mercy that can sprout even on the most scorched earth. Was this struggle worth such sacrifices? Was it worth surviving hell only to be forgotten? There is no simple answer. But this story is not just a chronicle of survival. It is a reminder that even in the heart of darkness, at the epicenter of all-consuming hatred, there is always room for a choice. A choice between revenge and forgiveness, between duty and conscience, between cruelty and humanity. And sometimes, a single person who makes the right choice can save not just a few lives, but the very idea of what it means to be human. Write in the comments what you think about this story, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other forgotten pages of history that deserve to be remembered.